You've endured 2 full days, possibly 3 days, chosen to be here with me today. And in case you want to leave, now's the right time. I will feel no offense. If you leave in the middle, it's kind of hurtful. So the big idea today, I've titled it, I think it was Patterns in People. And so, that's the journey. So we're going to start off, and I have a question for you. Do you have a favorite flower, plant, or tree? What made it your favorite? The way it looks, says Tanya. Yes, sir?
I love the linden tree, not only because of the way it grows,
yes.
but then the leaves, and then the flowers, and then the aroma that it gives so far off.
Yeah. So the linden tree, the way it grows, its shape and pattern, and the aroma it gives off. So you've hit numerous senses now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Renee?
My experience with it.
Your experience with it caused you to love it. Experience caused you to love, yes. So I'll share a story of one of mine. When I lived in Texas, my favorite tree was the one that was right outside my dining room window. I had planted it on the first anniversary of my mother's death. I chose that tree because I saw that same type of tree down the street, so I thought it was native. I chose it because it would be it would have small flowers every spring, and it would have small purple flowers, and purple was my mother's favorite color. I also chose it because it would drop many berries every year, hoping to generate new trees like itself. It became my favorite when I saw it become my son's favorite tree to practice climbing in. So while I would be in the house doing whatever was the next thing to be done in front of me, I would catch them outside that window, high up in the tree, trying the "no hands, Mom," waving at me, smile. Right now, I have a peace lily at home that my sons gave me for a birthday present 2 years ago. It's become a favorite as I care for it, as Renee said, with experience. I've enjoyed watching it as the blooms, per se, right? A peace lily is different. Come up, it can look like it's going to be another leaf, but it's a little wider, it's a little thinner, and then it turns white. And so I've enjoyed the experience of getting to know that tree. Do you have a favorite book? Or a book that you reread fairly regularly, periodically? All right, what's your favorite book? Oh, I forgot her name. Erin? The Brothers K. Why? You teach it every year, so you read it every year.
Different book every time.
Oh, but it's a different book every time, she says. That might be partly why it's loved. Anyone else? A favorite book? Yes, what's your name? Oh, Till We Have Faces.
Yeah.
Why?
Because it feels like it resonates with me and I'm trying to understand it. So every time there's something that hits me in my soul that my brain's trying to catch up with. I keep rereading it to try to figure it out.
So she's rereading it to try to figure it out because every time she reads it, it hits somewhere in her soul and she can't figure it out. So she wants to reread it to uncover that. Thank you. There's a wonder there that's continual. Yeah. Do you have a favorite book of the Bible? Monica? Proverbs. Why?
Because there's so much in there and I get something different every time. It hits me in a different way.
Because there's so much in there, it can hit her, impact her in a different way each time. So we like variety, but there's consistency. You know what you're getting when you're in Proverbs. Yeah. Another one? Yes. Hebrews. Why Hebrews? It's harder for me to hear you. I'm going to try to restate what I heard you say. But do you want to try to say it louder first, please?
Yeah, just the beauty of Christ fulfilling all the symbols and types of the Old Testament. He's our priest, the sacrifice.
The fulfillment of the Old Testament is seen in Hebrews, of how he becomes our high priest and our perfect sacrifice. So yeah, that completion of the story is part of its beauty. Thank you. Today, you've chosen to sit in a room where you're going to get to hear some of my favorite books of the Bible. And we're going to pass through as I see them. So I've been reading the Old Testament and meeting people, listening for echoes, and looking for patterns. I encourage you to do the same as you read. I believe you're going to see different patterns than I do, much like the stories you just shared, right? Monica brings out Proverbs, and I'm not going to bring you Proverbs today. So while what I share with you today is a beginning of what I can see, and I only see it dimly. My favorite books of the Bible are actually Exodus and Ruth. I can't as easily summarize for you why that is so, but maybe after we spend this time together today with us looking at them, as well as Deuteronomy and Habakkuk, you can tell me why they're my favorite. I think it has something to do with people and patterns. First, I'd like to summarize what I see in each book. Exodus shows us that Yahweh is a God like no other God. He called his people using their senses. He delivered them from slavery, and he tabernacled with them on a liminal land. Then, God provided his people with 613 ordinances to live by. Just a few. To some, those rules read like chains and weights. To me, I read them as a way to make a home. And just like homes have written and unwritten rules, God provided these rules for his people to live by, to become like him, and to help them learn what it means to live this life following his ordinances. He gave us the book of Ruth. It is a story of the people embodying his ordinances. And yet, this life on this earth is hard for much of us, for much of the time. And so God also provided us with the book of Habakkuk. And it gives us a model for expressing the pain and for praying with hope in God's faithfulness. Now, please look over my shoulders with me as I try to express to you what I see in these 4 books. We'll start with Exodus. A main message of Exodus expressed is captured in Moses' own words to Pharaoh. It's in Exodus 8:10, and he tells Pharaoh what's about to happen and why. He says, so that you may know that there is no other God like the Lord our God. This message is expressed through the weaving of 3 key elements: a calling, a delivering, and a tabernacling. God chose an oppressed people, he protected an oppressed people, and he resided with the oppressed people. In order for people to come to know that Israel's God was like no other, Exodus repeats that God called Moses. God called to Moses by name, Moses, Moses, after he saw that Moses turned his attention away from his flocks, away from his responsibilities, to witness the flaming bush that wouldn't burn. God's call first engaged Moses' visual senses, then it engaged his auditory senses, and finally his tactile sensory senses when he was told that he wasn't allowed to approach the bush with covered feet. God's calling was like no other. And further, God waited for Moses' attention to be on him and no longer on his responsibilities. From this brief encounter, I wonder, do I remain focused on the tasks of my responsibilities when I need to turn my attention to God, my provider? After the Israelites had departed Egypt, Moses ascended Mount Sinai, where the Lord called to him from the mountain. And this time, God shares a plan to make the Israelites his treasured possession out of all the peoples, is what he calls them. God doesn't stop there. He adds that he chose them as his treasure from the whole world, Exodus 19:5. God's call is to a specific oppressed people, Exodus 1:11, and he had the whole earth from which to choose. Both times that God calls to Moses, God includes a plan, first for delivering them from slavery, and second for reforming them into his people. So his people can be a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. God called Moses using physical sensation. God called Moses telling him a treasury plan, and God called Moses from an oppressed people. No other God called his people like the God of Israel, and no other God delivered his people like this God of Israel. In order for people to come to know that Israel's God was like no other, Exodus further expresses deliverance of a people from a tyrant. First, their cries ascended from the dirt of earth to the height of God. This movement characterizes the very nature of God. Exodus connects God and his people in a relationship. Exodus 2:24 tells us, God heard their groaning, God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Exodus' story attaches his oppressed people's cries to their God's attention. God noticed the oppressed. Further, God tells Moses his plan to deliver the Israelites by sending Moses back to a kingdom that actually protected him when a different tyrant declared that all Israelite male babies were to be cast into a river to die. sending an outcast murderer back to the land that twice tried to kill him in order to deliver a people from a tyrant, it's not a typical story. This God is like no other in his attention to people and in the people to which he chooses to work. Next, delivering these oppressed Israelites involved God dividing waters and the people walking across a dusty dirt. God's delivery plan recreated this people out of water. What do these choices of God reveal about his nature? He loves the unlovely, the dirty, and the oppressed. While God's deliverance plan is like no other because it includes hearing their cries, sending their son, and dividing their waters, his post-deliverance plan to tabernacle with his people further embodies his character. In order for people to come to know that Israel's God was like no other, Exodus weaves a tabernacle for God's glory to reside with his people. Exodus explains the tabernacle 3 times. If you were with us last night, you heard about the power of 3. The whole narrative slows down here to reveal that this is important. So from chapters 19 to 32, 14 chapters in total, God provides the form or the fencing for where these people are to live, for who these people are to be, and how they are to behave within their playground of life. Specifically in chapter 25, God acknowledges that he is giving them the pattern of the tabernacle. In great detail, each item's construction is presented. Now, sadly, the Israelites are an impatient people. So when Moses returns, he returns to a golden calf in their camp in Exodus 32. The next 7 chapters of this book include the purification of Moses and God outlining again the details for how this tabernacle is to be constructed. So a second full exposition of the tabernacle happens now. In this last chapter of this critical book, chapter 40, God tells Moses how to physically place all the tabernacle items in relationship to one another in that space. 3 times this book walks through the tabernacle with details in one section of 14 chapters, followed by a section of 7 chapters, concluding with a single chapter. These echoes of 7 serve to magnify the tabernacle's sacred place in the story and in revealing who God is. Additionally, the tabernacle's construction is expertly guided by 2 men who are inspired by the wind of God with the artistry and intelligence necessary. God's tabernacling plan includes filling 2 workmen with his very self. And lastly, this tabernacle is a microcosm. It is divinely ordered like the cosmos. Its pattern is an echo of the cosmos and is embodied in a smaller space where God's glory resides with his people. So in tabernacling with God, God's people learn about the cosmos, their God, and themselves. Why is the tabernacle required? For God's presence to dwell among his people? Maybe it's required because he is holy, separate, and to be feared, as well as present, listening, and seeing them. The story of Exodus is like no other, and it's necessary to knowing God. How God calls. He called with the senses of sight, sound, touch, probably smell. I wonder if that bush had a smell. And who God delivers. The oppressed and dejected people. And what God tabernacles in. It's a form that is articulated 3 times in detail with people given the craftsmanship to create it. These all embody the Lord and demonstrate that he is like no other. While this book clearly demonstrates it's important to know God, God still desires to reside with his people, and we, his people, would do well to study this pattern in the tabernacle and how to care for the tabernacle, which I think is the rest of the story. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy. What makes a home? Deuteronomy answers this question in one word, I think. Love. With 3 embodiments: remembering, talking, and creating. God commanded his people to love him by remembering his words, by talking about his words, and by creating remembrances of his words. Whether by remembering, talking, or creating, the purpose was to love God by their daily interactions and their choices amongst one another. In order for God's chosen people to have a home, to live like no other people with a specific land as their home, he commanded them to love him and therefore to love one another, as many of the ordinances and the commandments pertain to people's relationships with one another. God did not stop with a command to love him. He outlined actions that his people could reproduce that both demonstrate love and cultivate love. First, Deuteronomy establishes a home of love by remembering. Now, there's a key passage in Deuteronomy called the Shema, and it sounds its keynote, to love God. It's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away and when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as signs on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Loving God, at a quick glance, might appear like something that doesn't need any further explanation or description, as if people can just love him and love others. And while people desire to give and receive love, that's inherent in who we are, in our very nature, we often struggle with how to demonstrate this. And I believe the many stories and songs that we have of broken love show us the difficulty there. At the end of the first line of the Shema, we can ask the question, how? How is Israel to love God with all their being? He provides the answer. So if he tells us in the first line, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Ask how. The very next line tells us, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. To keep is to remember, to enact. People can only do that which they remember. Right? I'm not going to water the plants if I don't remember to. I'm not going to check the mail if I don't remember to. And I'm actually in trouble in my neighborhood because I don't check my mailbox often enough. The postal carrier warned my neighbors that he's going to stop delivering my mail to the little box. Yeah, I'm in trouble because I don't remember to check the mail. I'm also one who didn't remember to eat meals as a child. In college, I got a Timex watch, the first Timex that had 3 alarms on it to remind me to eat because I was one who didn't. I stayed busy. I didn't remember. So the specific commandment to keep the Sabbath was for more than just resting for one day of each week. It was also for these former slaves to remember that God rescued them. We need to remember more than actions. We need to remember who we are and whose we are. So further, Deuteronomy establishes laws that interrupt money flow and aid people's memory. In chapter 15, Deuteronomy instructs Israel to remit debts, to release slaves, to sacrifice animals, and to eat the bread of affliction. These actions aren't common, but by the people keeping them, they are both remembering where they came from and who they are. They are God's chosen people. Keeping these commandments shapes the people to love what God loves, which is people, and live where God provided, in a liminal space between 2 greater nations. And just like each home has rules for its family members, so too God's behavior rules for this nation are to live like the embodiment of God's love. As humans, we are a forgetful sort of being, and so God gave the next line of the Shema to answer the question, how are the people to keep his words in their heart? Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away and when you lie down and when you rise. Oftentimes, after a loved one dies, we find that we'll sit around and talk the stories of their lives. We'll recall by talking about the ordinances as God has commanded. People will remember them. If we recall them incorrectly, we're going to correct one another, as we do when we retell family stories. Anybody in your family jump up to say, that's not how it happened, right? These are the stories that unite a people and therefore make a home. Israel is to tell the story of being loved by God. Deuteronomy 7:8 tells us that. And having no fear of other nations. Deuteronomy 7:18 to 21. Of being warned to not forget God. Deuteronomy 8:14. What stories make up your family narrative? And as Israel observes the festivals, Deuteronomy 16, they're also telling the next generation God's words, so that the actions are more than actions. The festivals, as well as all the behaviors outlined previously, are connected to their status as chosen people. And they are the celebrations, the behaviors that make a home, the shared experiences of the family members. So one of the stories that we tell often in my family is of our family reunions. We go back to Fire Island on the 4th of July. I'm originally from Barrier Island off of Long Island, New York. We tell a story of a fabulous dinner that we got by accident in Paris of swordfish and risotto. And so now my 22-year-old in July turned 22, and every time you ask him, what do you want for your birthday dinner, he wants swordfish and risotto because of this accidental dinner. We tell the story of learning how to ski in the backcountry, where mom had her first injury. It's not too bad to make it to 48, 49 years old before I had my first sports injury. It's not so bad. We tell the story of my children. They learned how to scuba dive before they could drive a car. But I can't dive. I tried twice. My eustachian tube won't equalize. So the first time I was trying to dive, I couldn't get down. So I didn't progress. The second time I tried to learn how to dive when they were little and they were getting certified, I couldn't get back up. That's called a reverse block. And so the instructor told me, don't ever try again. So now we tell the stories of how moms land support. That's my job. But those are things that make up our story, right? Another one we tell is how God provided a cottage for us to live in when there was nowhere to live. We tell the story of how I stayed in a women's shelter as a kid with my mom. Those are just as much a part of our story as the fun ones that we kind of laugh at. And they remind us of who we are and whose we are and who provided for us and who saw us all along the way. So lastly, God gives Israel one more path of help. How are they to talk about this love and his many words? The last line of the Shema provides this needed answer. Bind them on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. God had a long-term plan. He wanted the people for many generations. Knowing that people are forgetful, God told them to make his words visible on their hands, on their foreheads, on their houses. Surely, this can mean those physical spaces of hands and foreheads and houses. And since people, and all people actually, not just children, but all people, become what we behold, God gave specific instructions for beholding his words. So further, another way that people might be beholding his words are in the words in the actions of those hands, when you watch somebody and how they treat another with their hands, or in those words spoken below the foreheads, or perhaps the words spoken and embodied within those homes. Israel was commanded to use those spaces to express love toward God. How does one love this God? By following his words in remembering, in talking, and in creating physical remembrance of those same words. One of the things we posted in my house was a poster beside the kitchen table on the wall, and we just called it miracles. And we add to the list the miracles we see that God has done in our midst, so we don't forget. And we can retell those simple stories of the almost, but thankfully not, car accident. Some people read Deuteronomy's many repeated detailed lists of behaviors as chains of oppression, or rules without relationships, or fences with armed guards. I don't see these views as being supportable. Deuteronomy's behavior lists exist in every family, in every home. Among these relationships as boundaries to know who is a part of the family and who isn't. Families operate within a home by these safe guiding boundaries. What are your family boundaries? What makes you a Roselle, a Kennedy? Jocelyn, your last name just left me. Tuma. What makes you a Lipinski? Deuteronomy instructs people to love him with three embodiments: of remembering, of talking, and of creating. Deuteronomy begins with 4 chapters that address Moses to prepare people for life in the land. And the rest of the book is instructions on how to live in this liminal space and how to make a home for a nation. As a good teacher, God, through Moses, laid out how his people can love him, and in so doing, they both make and experience home. The book of Deuteronomy is essential to the canon and to today because it demonstrates Deuteronomy's ordinances being embodied in the story of Ruth's community. When we look at Ruth, I'd like to look at Ruth because it's such an important book twice. We're going to go through it in 2 sets of 3. 3 story elements that I see in Ruth, as well as 3 themes or patterns that I see in Ruth. So Northrop Frye tells us in the book, The Great Code, Bible and Literature, He states, certain stories seem to have a peculiar significance. They are the stories that tell a society what is important for it to know, whether about its gods, its history, its laws, or its class structure. Ruth is precisely this kind of significant story. Ruth embodies the code of conduct God commanded his people, the Israelites, to follow. A message that Ruth expresses is the embodiment of God's ordinances in a story, and it's expressed through 3 story elements. It has an empty setting with followed ordinances and a marriage blessing. For Ruth to teach God's people their ordinances and significance, it begins with a key story element of an empty setting. The first sentence introduces us to a land experiencing a famine in Ruth 1:1. It is empty of sustenance. This land is named Bethlehem, which means house of bread. There's a famine. This is a house without bread. The paradox here raises readers' awareness when a family is forced to search foreign lands for food. By the 4th sentence of this book, we're introduced to a family, and the father of the family dies. It's pretty quick. Now the story's lacking a father. In the very next sentence, the family's further broken by the death of their only 2 children, 2 sons. This short story's setting contains 3 layers of emptiness: a land empty of bread, a family without a father, and a family without the hope of future children. After the mother of this family hears that food is again available in her hometown, she returns to Bethlehem empty, with a widowed foreigner daughter-in-law named Ruth. Ruth begins with a compounded experience of their emptiness to prepare listeners and readers for this key element of the story: what it looks like when a people live according to God's ordinances. This book embodies this. It lives it out for us, and it's a central part of the story. We first need to have that empty setting to see what it looks like. So the matriarch, Naomi, departs for home with her widowed foreign daughter-in-law, Ruth, who promised to remain by her side until death parts them. These 2 walking widowed women reach town and are asked by the local women, "Is this Naomi?" From Genesis 1 and 2, we see that, God gives specific names to specific things. He asks Adam to give names. Names are important here. And this time she's asked, "Is this Naomi?" And her response is she renames herself and says, "No, do not call me Naomi, but rather call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me." Ruth agrees later to go out and glean from the leftover harvest of other people's land. Gleaning isn't something that's allowed today on private land. You might get shot if you're in Texas. Yet, in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24, they both instruct God's people to allow the aliens, the orphans, and the widows to glean, as well as the needy, the strangers, and the aliens. Ruth is a needy alien widow, a vulnerable person caring for another more vulnerable than her, who the local Israelites clearly recognize as a stranger in a small town. These local people follow God's ordinances and allow her to glean. Further, God commands the next of kin to redeem property and to redeem widows. Deuteronomy 25. When the story's action rises to Boaz asking the closest next of kin to redeem Ruth's father-in-law's land, the closest next of kin says yes, until he hears it comes with a wife, right? And he says no, he's out. Boaz comes forward and he follows God's ordinance to redeem the land, the widow, and the dead man's name. With no special attention brought to these actions, the book of Ruth embodies obeying laws of gleaning and redeeming in the lives of the Israelites and of vulnerable people. So the last story element that conveys Ruth's message of following God's ordinances is the marriage blessing. God specifies blessing for those who follow his commands. In this story, after Boaz redeems Elimelech's land and marries Ruth, they are expecting a son. As in the beginning of the story, the local women speak to Naomi again. Only this time, the story of emptiness that Naomi wrote in is rewritten as a story of life by these local women. They tell her that she is no longer empty, for she has not been without a redeemer. And they tell her that her daughter-in-law, she is more precious than 7 sons. And they tell her that her grandson's name is Obed. When do the town folk name a child? The local women play an interesting role in the story. They ask Naomi her name, and they give Naomi's grandson his name. The local reapers and the landowner treat Ruth well. And further, the elders of this town at the gate, they proclaim a marriage blessing for their children, right? Boaz gathered up the local leaders when he asked the next of kin whether or not he would take the land and Ruth. And when the end decision is made and Boaz says it's going to be me, they speak a blessing over them. Many people following God's ordinances are not acting in isolation. No, God's ordinances are meant to be lived out within a community, as the story clearly embodies. And the marriage blessing is not one of isolation. Many people spoke in to this marriage blessing. Ruth expresses the embodiment of ordinances in a story through three story elements: that empty setting, the following of ordinances, and the marriage blessing. Through Ruth's story, and not another list of the laws, God teaches his people what living according to his law actually looks like. They can be a prosperous people, a people living alongside one another, caring for the vulnerable, widows and strangers. While gleaning and redeeming land may not be possible in all of our communities today, widows, orphans, and strangers, they are present in our communities today. Like children, we would do well to read the story repeatedly while we ask the Lord to have eyes to see and ears to hear where we are to act. We would also do well to seek the Lord for how to care for the vulnerable with loyalty, love, and kindness. The Hebrew word for this type of care is hesed. The whole story of Ruth is needed to embody hesed. It is the active caring, like Ruth's hesed toward Naomi and Boaz's hesed toward Ruth, to which we are commanded as his people. So let's take a look there. We're going to look at these three patterns: hesed, redemption, and vulnerability. Hesed is traditionally defined as loving kindness or steadfast love. It could be defined as the glue of a covenant relationship. Boaz and Ruth are two characters whose lives are characterized by hesed. Both live upright lives, acting according to faith and righteousness. The book tells us the theme of faithful loving kindness is the backbone of Ruth, even though the word is only used 3 times in this book. Hesed is a word that can be most deeply understood in the context of relationships. So Ruth shows hesed to Naomi when she refuses to leave her on the road back to Bethlehem. Her oath is a stunning demonstration of faith and love. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. This is recognized as extraordinary love by Boaz. And yet Boaz is even more astounded later in the story when Ruth seeks protection and marriage from him. He exclaims to her, "This kindness, this hesed, is greater than that which you have showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor." In both instances, Ruth chooses to leave the known for the unknown in a leap of faith, acting with both character and courage. Boaz demonstrates hesed toward Ruth and ultimately Naomi as he protects Ruth when she gathers food and he accepts her as his wife. Yahweh's hesed for Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi is recognizable in this book. At the end of the story is a celebration of life. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And then he went to her and the Lord enabled her to conceive and she gave birth to a son. So this story starts with death, famine, loss, emptiness, and it ends with marriage and a child. This is Yahweh's doing. For Ruth specifically, living a life of loving faithfulness meant trusting in Yahweh, and it led her into the family of God. And we can anticipate, through Ruth's offspring, God's ultimate act of hesed, which you pointed to in Hebrew, for Israel and the world and the future birth of Jesus, whose death provides an entrance for all to the family of God. Redemption. Now, the word redemption, so if hesed shows up in the book 3 times, redemption is in this book 23 times. And it's a very small book. The first layer of redemption is Boaz fulfilling his duty as kinsman redeemer. Naomi had suffered the death of her husband and 2 sons, and no one remained to continue the line of her husband, Elimelech. Naomi was old, unlikely, right, to produce another son. She even asked that, I'm not going to make another son here. These deaths leave Naomi bitter and looking for help. Boaz acts rightly toward Elimelech and Naomi, and he marries Ruth, providing protection and security, and a son. One meaning of redemption is the regaining of a possession that has been lost. We see this fulfilled in the person of Obed as he regains the family inheritance, and through his line, it's carried forward. Yet Yahweh's provision of redemption for Naomi's family is accomplished through a Moabite woman. Someone who is supposedly excluded from the assembly of God repeatedly in the Old Testament. Yahweh also continues his story of redemption for the world through the line of Boaz. Boaz acts as a redeemer, foreshadowing the significance of his descendant, Jesus. Jesus fulfills the deepest meaning of the word redemption, the act of saving from sin. Now, the beginning of Ruth is marked by women who are the epitome of vulnerability. They are widows, and they're traveling without protection. Naomi is old, and they're living in a dangerous time, a time of the judges. When they arrive in Bethlehem, Ruth is obviously a foreigner and vulnerable as she works in the fields. Men might have taken advantage of her, Scripture tells us. Ruth and Naomi have little social standing in a kinship-based culture. Ruth literally put herself at Boaz's feet. In the midst of all of that is against them, they do something quite remarkable. They embrace their own vulnerability, and they trust God. Together, they take one step at a time, and God provides for them. Yahweh uses Boaz, but it is God's hand that extends protection on them. And again, we see another facet of God's protection for a Moabite. This book of Ruth shows us that God responds to those who step out in faith with vulnerability. These women provide inspiring examples for us to follow. Often when I feel fear or doubt, I want to figure everything out on my own. Ruth and Naomi were active agents. They weren't waiting. They allowed God to lead and direct them. Through Ruth, I'm challenged to act with my own agency and faith. God uses those who walk by faith to accomplish his purposes on earth, even those who seem to be outside of the accepted circle. And masterfully, he takes our individual stories and he weaves them into his own story of redemption for the world. Let's look at Habakkuk. Right, if you read the description, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, Habakkuk wasn't in there. But I sat and pondered to bring, we're okay on time, to bring this here. We're not complete without this last book. So Bishop Irene in the book, The Beginnings of a Life of Prayer, explains, prayer that is rooted in sure hope is grafted into the Lord, ever moving toward and residing in him, so it has the stability to give rise to the highest of virtues. Habakkuk is another short book of only 3 chapters now, and it concludes with a prayer that provides the stability and is rooted in sure hope. A main message of the book of Habakkuk is to trust God. This message of trust is expressed in 3 themes. It is good to ask questions, it is good to have faith, and it is good to pray. So in the middle of violence, destruction, and injustice, Habakkuk cried out to the Lord in the form of questions. It is good to ask questions, especially of the Lord, because he demonstrated here twice that he listens and he answers. By this book capturing the questions of a man and the responses of the Lord, readers across the eons are provided a model for approaching him. We have a God who hears and responds to our questions, to our cries, to our complaints. Our God is worthy to be trusted. A wise man once said, "The quality of one's life is determined by the quality of one's questions." Anyone know this wise man? Yes, Andrew Kern. Thank you, Jesse. So Habakkuk's questions deal with the daily yet ongoing struggle of living amidst suffering and evil. God's response for Habakkuk was to write the vision, to make it plain on tablets. God's response wasn't for one person for one moment. It was to be captured and told for generations. By asking hard questions, such as he did, he asked, "Why do you look on the treacherous and are silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than they?" We today can thankfully find ourselves in these same questions as well. God demonstrated his trustworthiness in listening and responding to Habakkuk's questions on injustice. Now, these injustices that Habakkuk references in his complaints and cries are still prominent today. People today still need an expression for their cries of help. How are the kids in your classroom? How are the families in your community or your churches? I heard many people last night at the apprenticeship graduation reference what it's been like since COVID and how the graduates this year began the apprenticeship during the shutdown of COVID and how that's been a different experience for them on their journey. We as a nation are still recovering. We need to have Habakkuk to help us know how to express these feelings. So oftentimes we will go to a family member, a friend, a coworker to have a conversation about the state of the world. And yet, the resolutions aren't always present, right? The pain is still present. We have leaders who are making decisions for the betterment of our nation. And yet with our leaders and our elections, people are still experiencing suffering and injustice in our land. So God's second response to Habakkuk instructs the people to look at the righteous who live by their faithfulness. Habakkuk 2:4. This line, it's pretty brief. It could be overlooked, yet it's echoed in Romans 1:17, as well as elsewhere throughout the Bible. Habakkuk's prayer at the end of this book demonstrates faithfulness with his words. Though the fig trees do not blossom, I will rejoice in the Lord. Throughout the writings of these 3 chapters, Habakkuk demonstrates honesty and faith that are rooted in hope. Many theologians actually disagree on the genre of this small book, but there's a consensus that the first 2 chapters are a dialogue between Habakkuk and God, and it ends with a faithful prayer. This prayer holds the tension between waiting for the calamity to strike their attackers while there is no herd in the stalls. There are people, again, without sustenance and harvest. While they're waiting to be attacked, they're expecting it to come. And yet, it ends with, we will exalt in the God of our salvation. Habakkuk 3:18. They trust the Lord. We as people and the people then need to see other people trusting God's sovereignty over human history. Because as Habakkuk stated, the righteous will live by their faithful trust in Yahweh. This book demonstrates that people who struggle can be faithful to a faithful God and not be drawn into a sea of despair. Now, while Habakkuk begins with questions concerning the suffering of a fallen world, it concludes with this prophet's prayer. As he begins, he says in 3:2, he stands in awe of the Lord's work. What moves his heart so to stand in awe? Certainly, the conversation with the creator of the universe during which Habakkuk recalls that God is who he is and what God has done could play a role in the movement of his heart. But when he goes through that list of who God is and what he has done, he is reminded that God covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise, that God split the earth with rivers, and he also recalled that God crushed the head of the wicked house and he laid bare from foundation to roof the wicked. These recollections of what the Lord has done to create and maintain his people and this world caused Habakkuk to tremble within, says 3:16. Bishop Irene explains that prayer, given its body by faith, thus receives its motion from hope. And hope moves our prayer beyond our tongue, beyond our minds, and into our heart. This is what allowed Habakkuk to acknowledge, God, the Lord, is my strength. Habakkuk's prayer moved his heart. Prayer changed Habakkuk, and it can change us, all of us who pray. Habakkuk's message to trust in God is expressed in 3 themes: questioning injustice, living by faith, simultaneously praying with hope. Habakkuk's short 3 chapters embody faith and hope in the midst of suffering that conclude with prayer, and it's a prayer that reminds our hearts to trust the Lord. His prayer is rooted in hope that gives rise to the greatest of virtues: faith, hope, and love. Habakkuk needs to be read today to show us how to make this proclamation. Honestly proclaiming the truth of injustice, the truth of faithfulness, and the truth of God's character draws us closer to loving God, to loving others, and to virtuous living. So again, I'd like to summarize what I see in each of these books. Exodus shows us that Yahweh is a God like no other God. He called his people using their senses. He delivered his people from slavery, and he tabernacled with his people on a liminal land. Then God provided his people with 613 ordinances to live by. As I said, to some, those are chains and weights. Yet to me, they make a home. And just like homes have written and unwritten rules, God provided these for his people to live by, to become like him. To help them learn what it means to live life following his ordinances, the book of Ruth is needed. It's a story of the people embodying his ordinances. It's a story that welcomes the outcast Moabite, and it places her in the lineage of David and Jesus. And yet this life on earth is hard. And so God has given us Habakkuk, which gives us a model for expressing the pain and for praying with hope and faithfulness. So, what's the pattern I see across these 4 books? I might tell you. Before I tell you, I'll let you ponder. What is the pattern you see across these 4 books? I've been told we can have a mic for a question. This is a question, and I'm going to keep talking, so it's going to go back and forth, but we have Tanya up here at the front, Cooper. Hill's going to provide a mic so I don't have to repeat. Thank you.
So I was thinking kind of a theme that runs throughout is that God is trustworthy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh. Anyone else want to share? As you looked over my shoulder at what I've been seeing, what did you see? Yes, sir. Cooper's on his way.
I see looking at these 4, it's a deep love that God's showing his people that he has for them.
Thank you.
I saw that God is continuing to reach out to his people in the same ways. That the same God of Moses and of Ruth and of Habakkuk is our God as well.
Thank you. Right up front here, Aaron. Thank you, Cooper.
He's concrete in all the things through the senses and how he loves. It's not an abstract love, but it's really, you can hold on to it. And then in Ruth and Habakkuk, he's concrete in pain and he being united to that.
Thank you, Aaron. Renee.
Not only is he a God that sees the oppressed, he's the Father that pulls them into himself over and over again.
Thank you. In the back row, I see, oh, wait, if you want to come up while you're in the front, Suzanne is here, and then you can head to the back.
It seems that at the very beginning of each story, there's a struggle of some sort, and at the end, there's always hope and redemption.
Can everybody hear her? Okay, I see head nods. Okay, thank you, Suzanne.
We have a God who dwells with his people.
Thank you. We have a God who dwells with his people. On the back, Kate.
In each story, there were patterns of provision. That even though there were laws that were prescriptive, they were also providing at the same time.
Thank you. Monica, up here. Thanks, Cooper.
The Lord knows what's good even when we don't.
Thank you. So when I tried to summarize it for myself after sitting with the books, right, because they're different and they're vast, they're short and they're long, and they're embedded in other stories as well, and they're not in isolation from one another, and they show up in the New Testament as well. Although I do have a good friend who says we don't need the New Testament, the Old Testament's enough. But I would tell you that one of the patterns I see is that God is enough and we are enough. God is Jehovah Jireh. And so somebody said it, he provides, he sees. And it's his who has the power to rescue, to create order, to bless, to love, to redeem, to see and to hear our prayers. And he provides that for us. So, I welcome any questions. Yes, Tanya. Well, hold on. I do not know your name, young man. Edmund, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you don't mind indulging me for a moment. Can we revisit a quote that you provided us kind of in the beginning, somewhere near the beginning, by Northrop Frye?
Sure.
Do you mind rereading that? I just want to think on that again in light of your entire talk.
Gladly. It's the Great Code, right? Do you know which book I used it in? Ruth?
Just before you started Ruth.
Deuteronomy?
Yeah.
For those of you who know me, you know this is not my strength to have a written out. Normally I just have one piece of paper with some notes and I speak. So this was different for me.
It was just before you got into Ruth.
Just before Ruth? Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be after Deuteronomy. Oh, right there. Okay, I just couldn't see it. So he states, certain stories seem to have a peculiar significance. They are the stories that tell a society what is important for it to know, whether about its gods, its history, its laws, or its class structure. Where does your mind go there? Edmund's coming.
Thank you, Edmund. It kind of ties in a lot of the things that people brought up, right? Provision, trust, dwelling with his people, a lot of that Frye talked about in that quote. What book was that from?
It's called The Great Code, Bible and Literature.
Okay, so he was specifically talking about God in the Bible. Okay.
Yeah. Last summer at the conference, I think it was Justin Jackson, gave 2 talks about reading the Bible as literature. And so it got me thinking. So I pursued some more. He pointed us to a different book, and somebody else pointed me to this book, and so that's the one I was reading in. Yeah.
I love how we see God working through multiple people, right? Through Jackson last year, through Northrop Frye in this book that he wrote whenever he wrote it, through your friend who pointed you towards this book, all to come together and pour into each one of us that are in this room and give us a new perspective on books in the Bible that we've probably all read before. And probably more than one of us is now going to go back and revisit some of those books with this better understanding and some more things to look for as we read through them. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tanya. Anyone else? Beth?
So in Habakkuk,
No?
you gave us the first 3, the ask questions, have faith, pray.
Pray.
And then you said there were 3 themes, and I think it was kind of like a restating.
It's those 3.
Okay,
Yeah.
just wanted to make sure I didn't miss them.
Nope. Yeah. Again, this is just me reading and pondering and sitting with the Word and asking the Lord, what do these have to do with one another and for your people? So it was GHC this year, I think. I don't know how many of you have written talk titles and descriptions, but oftentimes you're asked to write a talk title and description long before you deliver it. And so sometimes something happens between the time you write the talk title and description and you deliver it, and they change, right? And so I was, for GHC, Beth, you might have been present in the room when this happened. So I committed to giving a talk on taking CiRCE's definition of Christian classical education and pulling on each word and talking about them, right, to uncover them and show their relationship to one another. So I had to come up with a definition and talk about the word wisdom. That doesn't feel concrete when you have to talk about it in front of other people. And so I was like, how do I describe that? Do you remember what I said, Beth? Okay. And so what I pondered, and the way I could express it, and I can change my mind in 5 minutes, and one of you can help me change my mind in 5 minutes, was that wisdom is the the opportunity, the ability to see patterns and to use them to impact your decisions. And so when I sat there, I've been looking for patterns. And so that's how this came about. I will close at, right? Am I right at the closing? I'll close with why, just to share a little bit more. Exodus is my favorite book of the Bible. And then Ruth became the second, and now I don't know. So Exodus is my favorite book of the Bible because I was not raised in a Christian home. I was one of those kids who somebody showed up at the playground on Sundays and asked all of the kids who were playing on the on Saturdays, asked all the kids playing on the playground, do you want a snow cone? I'm like, yeah, 2. And so they said, great, come back here tomorrow morning at this time. We're going to pick you up and take you on a bus. We're going to go to church. After church, we're all going to have snow cones, and then we'll bring you right back to this playground. I said, great. These are one of those things, like gleaning, picking up kids on playgrounds, both things that wouldn't happen today, right? So, yeah. So I'm on the bus. I tell my mom about this, and she has no problem. She gets me up. She gets me dressed. She puts me in a dress, puts little coins in my pocket. She knows something about that, right? So puts coins in my pocket. She sends me. And I go to church, and I learn church is good. It tastes great, right? Jesus should taste good. I'll tell you that story. And so somewhere along the way, somebody gave me a Bible. It was actually one of my teachers, my 3rd grade teacher. So in that instance, I'm very young, and I just learned church is good. I get to 3rd grade, and I get invited to church again by my 3rd grade teacher. And I know church is good, right? It tastes good. So I say, yes, I'll go. So she goes out of her way 45 minutes each direction to take me to church and gives me my first Bible. And I was one who sat in my closet with my flashlight to read my Bible. My mom is not a Christian. By the time I hit junior high, I'm now arguing with my mother over this whole church thing because she tells me I'm a hypocrite because I go to church on Sundays, yet I fight with my sister, right? I have no way to explain myself. I'm a teenager trying to figure out life. So at some point I give up. But in those years when I was reading my Bible in my closet with my flashlight, I'm reading Exodus. And I read in Exodus, I'm pretty sure it's right after the 10 Commandments. Is it 20? I won't be able to pull it up right now for y'all. Where he says that for those who love the Lord, he will bless for 1,000 generations. And for those who don't, he will curse for 3 to 4 generations. And so I asked God as a child in that closet to make me the 3rd and the 4th generation in my family. I needed it to stop. I wanted 1,000 generations of blessings to come after me. That's why it's my favorite book of the Bible. So for me to return to it now as an adult, I've never left from it. It's something I've reread. But it's been quite a joy to come now as an educator looking for different patterns. So that's what I shared with you today. There was another thing that I mentioned. I said, I should tell you that story. What was that one? Tastes good. Good one. So we attend a church where my pastor believes we will only eat one meal on Sunday. And there's quite a few people who are gluten-free. And so we need to have gluten-free food for our communion bread, right? And so at some point, my 18-year-old son tells me, out of the blue, completely disconnected, on a Tuesday at 10, Mom, Jesus tastes bad. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, you've been there, Mom. You know it. Jesus tastes bad. Like, I'm not getting it. And he's like, every Sunday, communion, Jesus tastes bad. Oh. So that was it. I set about making sure Jesus is going to taste good, right? Because snow cones taste good. Jesus is going to taste good. So I've been working on a different bread recipe for a while of gluten-free bread until I got one that most of the congregation was, happy with. And so we've just been playing. So now we all know Jesus tastes good. So may you also know that Jesus tastes good. So thank you for joining me today.